Let me start by a word of thanks to my colleagues, Professors Stephen Cohen, Robert Chazen, and Ori Yehudai, especially to Ori for the work that was invested in the course of a year in putting this conference together. We've had a remarkable response. It's 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, and we have an almost full hall. We had almost double capacity in the RSVPs, which is why we imposed on everybody to reconfirm their intentions in coming. We've obviously touched a nerve in the topic of today. I would especially like to thank the indefatigable Shane Figueroa, who is right now at the front desk and is not hearing these thanks. She's the Taub Center administrator. Without Shane, none of the organizational attributes would have been possible. The conference was conceived 6 months ago when there was much discussion about attitudes of young liberal Jews towards Israel, and much angst whether the next generation of the Jewish community would share the attitudes of their parents, the emotional and political attachment to the Jewish state. The occupation, the failed peace process, the role of religious orthodoxy in Israel, and other issues in Israeli society are all causes of what might be a growing discontent between Israel and American Jewry. Whether or not this is true, whether the relationship really is in transition, cries out for closer examination and discussion. How significant is the distinction between attachment to Israel and criticism of Israeli policies? What role does the growing reality of intermarriage in one sector of the community, on the one hand, and the rise of Jewish orthodoxy on the other, have on attitudes to Israel? These were some of the original questions we wished to address at this conference. Since then, the issues have become even more acute. The sudden and dramatic geopolitical changes in the Middle East will impact Israel's standing in the world. Open disagreements between the Obama and Netanyahu governments might well be the forerunner of an era when American and Jewish strategic interests are not automatically aligned. I should have said American and Israeli strategic interests are not automatically aligned. And this will surely have an impact on the relationship of American Jewry to Israel. The time has truly come for an examination of where we are and where we are heading. From the outset, we decided to bring the conference to the attention of the NYU community, as well as those scholars, journalists, and community officials for whom the issue is central to their concerns. We intentionally decided not to advertise the conference widely in the hope that our dialogue today will be a studied and considered one rather than an impassioned and heated discussion. However, even without advertising, we were overwhelmed by the response. Perhaps this was the result of the promo that Benjamin Netanyahu gave our event when he appeared before the Houses of Congress. We will examine these issues in 4 sessions, which will be introduced by the chairs of each session separately. And they will also introduce the speakers, so I won't do that now. All that remains for me to do is to introduce the chairs themselves. Michal Biton is a junior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Center of North America and a doctoral student at NYU. Michal is researching the Syrian Jewish community in New York, and we all look forward to seeing her work in its completion. Lisa Grant is the professor of Jewish education. Lisa is the chair of the second session, is the professor of Jewish education at the Hebrew Union College, and has spent many years researching the subject of Israel education. Amir Shaviv is the Assistant Executive Vice President for Special Operations at the JDC, the Joint, and has been a long-time observer of the relationship between Israel and American Jewry. J.J. Goldberg, the moderator of the evening's panel, As the editor-at-large of The Forward, certainly needs no introduction to this audience. Today's conference will only be able to scratch the surface of this important subject, but at least we are starting a dialogue. No matter how difficult this dialogue will be, please remember that sustenance and comfort will be available when lunch is served, between the first and second sessions, and dinner before the final panel discussion. Michal, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hi. Can everyone hear me? All right, great. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first panel discussion for our conference today. It's really exciting to be here with such wonderful speakers who will be talking about what is arguably one of the most important items on the agenda of the American Jewish community today. Let me just say quickly about the breakdown of the panel, how it's going to go. We're going to start with our speakers giving presentations about the topic. From there, we'll enter a conversation in which the panelists will have the opportunity to ask each other questions, as well as answer some questions that I will ask them. And afterwards, we'll enter into a Q&A with the audience. So please, as they are talking, just think about the questions that you want to be asking them at the end. And now, without further ado, let me just introduce the speakers in the order in which they will be presenting. We'll start with Dov Waxman. Dov Waxman is Professor of Political Science, International Affairs, and Israel Studies at Northeastern University and the co-director of its Middle East Center. He is the author of The Pursuit of Peace and the Crisis of Israeli Identity, Defending or Defining the Nation, and the co-author of Israel's Palestinians, The Conflict Within. He writes regularly for Haaretz and is a regular guest commentator on Al Jazeera America. After that, Ted will address us. Theodor Sasson is Professor of Jewish Studies at Middlebury College, a senior research scientist at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University, and a consultant to the Mandel Foundation. He is the author of The New American Zionism, which was recently released on paperback on April 8th. Professor Sasson is co-principal investigator for many studies of Taglit Birthright Israel, and is a member of the board of directors of the Association for Israel Studies. And lastly, Stephen M. Cohen is research professor of Jewish social policy at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion and director of the Berman Jewish Policy Archive at NYU Wagner. He is the prolific author of hundreds of articles and over a dozen books, including co-authoring The Jew Within and Two Worlds of Judaism, the Israeli and American Experience. He was a lead researcher on the 2011 Jewish Community Study of New York and was a consultant to the recently conducted Pew Study of American Jews. Stephen is also one of my doctoral advisors and has been a generous and supportive mentor. So I'm really excited to be sitting here for what should be a really exciting and stimulating conversation. And what's especially noteworthy, I think, about our three panelists is that they're not only distinguished academics, but they're actually helping shape the public conversation that's happening right now about the relationship between American Jews and Israel. So,
thank you. Thank you, Michal. And I want to also thank Ron Zweig for organizing this important conference. I obviously think this is important because I'm writing a book on this subject. So I thank you for organizing it, and I'm pleased to see so many of you here on this beautiful spring morning. So let me begin by, can everybody hear me okay, first of all? Yeah? Okay, great. I want to begin then by briefly stating my main claim about the relationship between American Jews and Israel, and then that it is no surprise that it's profoundly changing. Specifically, it's becoming more critical, more contentious, and more divisive. Now, I am not claiming, and I want to emphasize this, that American Jews are becoming increasingly detached from Israel, that there is growing detachment. This is a claim that's often made in the media, that American Jews are growing more emotionally disconnected and distant from Israel. In fact, at least up until now, and I know we're going to hear more comments from my very illustrious co-panelists who have done extensive work on this subject, at least until now there has not been any sign of declining attachment, that American Jews have continued to express a strong level of emotional attachment to Israel. So I'm not going to focus on the question of their emotional attachment. What I am arguing, though, is that American Jews are becoming increasingly critical about Israeli government policies, and that they are becoming increasingly divided over those policies, and that they are increasingly arguing over those policies, and that this is not a sign of their declining attachment. On the contrary, American Jews argue about Israel so much precisely because they do care about Israel so much. So the growing argument that we are witnessing today within the American Jewish community is not a sign of a declining attachment. On the contrary, it's a sign of a continuing attachment to the country. What is happening, in other words, is that while the emotional, what I would call the emotional consensus of affection, attachment to Israel is still there, at least for now, the political consensus is steadily, gradually eroding. And it's happening over time. It's not happening overnight. And this has been a long-term process of erosion. And I also want to emphasize that it has not totally disappeared. This is a process of erosion. The political consensus has not collapsed altogether. Again, contrary to reports in the media, American Jewry as a whole is not as polarized in its views about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular, as it sometimes appears. And this is important. While there is a declining consensus, there are still broad areas of agreement within the American Jewish community. Most Jews still accept the need for and the importance of a Jewish state. Most still want a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and believe that this is possible. But while those broad areas of agreement continue to exist, there are other issues, in particular two that I will single out, about which there is growing disagreement, and they are highly divisive. And they are the issue of the establishment of a Palestinian state, specifically, and the future of Israel's settlements in the West Bank. Those are the two issues which consistently in surveys conducted by the AJC are the ones that are the subject of most division, with roughly, on the question of the Palestinian state, roughly half of American Jews generally favoring this and half opposing it. Of course, the numbers fluctuate slightly from year to year. On the question of the future of Jewish settlements, while a solid majority of American Jews do support the dismantling of some or all settlements, much smaller numbers support the dismantling of all settlements, but a solid majority support the dismantling of some or all. A significant minority, ranging from 35 to 45%, oppose the dismantling of any settlements. So on those two issues in particular, they are highly divisive. In addition, underlying the differences of opinion among American Jews concerning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are more significant differences between various subgroups within the American Jewish population. Three stand out as the most important in terms of the impact that they have on attitudes toward the conflict. First, the difference in opinion between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews. This is a significant difference of opinion. I mentioned before on the question of settlements. Orthodox Jews are much more supportive of the Israeli settlement enterprise than are non-Orthodox Jews. And this is just one item that shows up consistently in the survey data. Second is the differences between liberals and conservative. Liberals, those who identify as liberals in the United States, those who identify as conservatives, and similarly between Democrats and Republicans. Now, we've heard a lot about the partisan differences, or the what some have called the partisan gap that is emerging within American politics between liberals and conservatives when it comes to Israel. This partisan gap is also present among American Jews, so that American Jewish conservatives or Republicans are also much more hawkish when it comes to issues concerning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than are liberal or Democrat voters. And finally, the other significant differences between younger and older Jews. Again, we've heard a lot about this. And although I think we shouldn't overplay the significance of generational difference, there are, again, in the surveys, clear differences of opinion when it comes to many issues between these two groups. Basically, what these differences amount to is that more secular, more liberal, and younger Jews are much more likely, statistically, to hold dovish views about the conflict than more religious, more conservative, and older Jews. This is essentially what it amounts to. Young Jews in particular, their support for Israel is more tentative and less automatic. They care about Israel, but they see Israel as less in need of their support, and they're less willing to give their support to Israel unconditionally. That is, they will only support Israel if it acts in accordance with their values and their beliefs. And they simply don't think that Israel automatically must be supportive. And one, I think, particularly arresting statistic in the Pew survey that was carried out, and I'm sure you're going to hear quite a lot of the Pew survey today, because it was it surveyed 3,500 Jews across 50 states. It's the most comprehensive survey that's been conducted of the American Jewish community in about a decade, and therefore it's really provided an important resource for anybody interested in understanding this relationship. One particular nugget from this survey is the fact that a quarter of American Jews aged between the ages of 18 to 29 thinks the United States supports Israel too much, which is quite staggering when compared to the fact that only 5% of Jews aged 50 and older think so. So there's quite a difference of opinion. Basically, I would say among American Jews more generally, support for Israel today is no longer automatic or axiomatic. So I should qualify that. Support for the Israeli government is no longer axiomatic or automatic. The age of uncritical and unconditional support for Israel is over. And going back to the Pew survey, we can see this in many of the data points. For instance, in the survey, 48%, a plurality of American Jews, thought the Israeli government is not the Netanyahu government, that is, isn't making a sincere effort to come to a peace agreement with the Palestinians. That's a high level of skepticism. 44%, also a plurality, thought that Israel's construction of settlements in the West Bank hurts Israel's security. So I think these are indicative of a broad shift in opinion among some parts of the American Jewish community. As unconditional support for Israel has declined, there has been a growing debate about Israel and specifically about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israel's policies toward the Palestinians, both within Israel and within the occupied territories, within the American Jewish community. So American Jews today are now engaged in a very bitter, very public debate about Israel and about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And there was always, to some extent, a debate. I don't want to exaggerate the novelty of this debate, but I think what is significant about the debate today is that it is much more public. It's really out in the open. Before, it might have been taking place in the conference rooms of American Jewish organizations. Now it's happening very much in the public sphere. And it is more divisive, and it is much, much more acrimonious. It's really become a quite ugly debate, a debate in which those on the left and right, and there are more sides to this debate than simply left and right, but for now I'll just use those broad categories. Both sides vilify each other publicly, accuse each other of endangering Israel's very survival, if not even endangering Jewish identity. The right accuses the left of being anti-Israel, disloyal, and even self-hating Jews. And the left accuses the right of being fascists and racists. And both blame each other for Israel's predicament. And this increasingly toxic, ugly debate over Israel and over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is really seeping in onto the grassroots of Jewish communities. It's leading rabbis to avoid talking about Israel. It's leading to arguments among members of the same synagogue. It's forcing Jewish community centers to avoid inviting controversial speakers or putting on events that could become controversial. And it's frightening many Jews from even talking about Israel altogether to their friends, to their family, lest it spark angry arguments. So what are the implications of all this? I know I have to conclude, so I'm going to wrap up. What I think the big implication of my remarks this morning is that Israel is gradually going from being a source of consensus among American Jews to a source of division. It's going from being a unifying force among American Jews to a polarizing force. And this is a deep and profound change. And the significance of this is not merely just a debate between, polarization between hawks and doves, because political differences, religious differences, and even if you might say cultural differences, reinforce each other. So those on the left, as I said, are generally liberals who vote Democrat in American elections. The right tend to be conservatives and vote Republican. So the partisan divide in American politics, a divide which we know all too well has been very bitter in recent years, is also reinforcing and deepening the Jewish political divide, if you like. And it's not just a political divide among American Jews, it's also a religious divide. Political and religious divisions reinforce each other. So as I said before, Orthodox Jews tending to be on the right, and non-Orthodox Jews tending to be in the center to the center left. And finally, in addition to this, it's also in some sense a cultural divide, a divide which we might identify between post-tribal and tribal Jews, between those who are embracing a more fluid, maybe postmodern, individualistic sense of Jewish identity, something that my co-panelist Stephen Cohen has written about, and those who continue to adhere and cling on to a more ethnic, tribal, particularistic sense of Jewish identity. So this isn't just a passing phenomenon. This isn't just a response to the re-election of Benjamin Netanyahu. It's not just a response to one bill in the Knesset to another. This is a deep shift that is taking place. I think it's been taking place since at least the early 1980s, and I think it's here to stay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming out this morning. I'm going to talk mostly about survey data and mostly on the question of emotional attachment to Israel. I'm going to talk about arguments concerning the possible distancing of American Jews from Israel. This is a piece, of course, of our broader conversation, and I'm glad that Dov opened up with the broad canvas. I'm going to take us into some of the nitty-gritty in the next 15 minutes or so. There are three lines of argument that we hear concerning the possible distancing of American Jews from Israel. One line of argument holds that American Jews are distancing because successive generations are further, in the temporal sense, from the Holocaust, from the founding of the state, from the Six-Day War. We'll call that the generational decline hypothesis. A second line of argument is that American Jews are distancing from Israel because the mostly liberal younger generation is outraged by the conduct of Israeli governmental policy, especially concerning the Palestinians, but also issues of civil rights, and religion and state. We can call that the liberal outrage hypothesis. The third line of argument concerning the possible distancing of American Jews from Israel is that the changing demography of American Jewry, especially as a consequence of the sustained high rate of intermarriage, is diminishing the intuitive ethnic connection that American Jews feel to Israel, and as a consequence, generating distancing over time. We can call that the intermarriage indifference hypothesis. So let's look at each of these hypotheses in light of some of the survey evidence. The first slide here shows emotional attachment to Israel by generation in the Pew survey that Dov described, the 2013 Pew survey. The image is familiar to many of us in the room. It shows that emotional attachment increases with age. The boomers and the silent generation are more attached than the millennials and Generation X. This age-related increase in Israel attachment from the younger generations to the older generations is often cited as evidence of generational decline. The problem is that younger Jews have been less attached to Israel in all surveys that have been published over the last 3 decades. Younger Jews were less attached to Israel in the annual surveys conducted by the American Jewish Committee all the way back to 1983. They were less attached to Israel in the National Jewish Population Surveys conducted in 2000 and 1990. And younger Jews are typically less attached to Israel in the dozens of community studies conducted by federations throughout the United States. Moreover, as we see in the next slide, which shows the time series from the American Jewish Committee's annual surveys, attachment to Israel has not declined over time. And the Pew Research Center came to the same conclusion in its analysis of its 2013 survey. Compared to the previous National Jewish Population Survey in 2000, the Pew researchers concluded that there has been no decline in overall attachment to Israel among American Jews. And so if younger Jews have always been less attached to Israel, and if the level of attachment has not declined over time, we can only conclude that the age-related pattern in attachment to Israel reflects a life stage dynamic and not a generational dynamic. Over the last 3 decades, American Jews have become more attached to Israel as they have aged. Now, that doesn't mean that that's how it'll work in the future. So let's consider the liberal outrage hypothesis. Here we see political orientation by attachment to Israel in the Pew survey. Indeed, the liberals in the Pew survey are less emotionally attached than the moderates, who are less attached than the conservatives. Now, this pattern is common in cross-sectional surveys of American Jewry, but in separate analyses of data sets from the mid-2000s, Professor Kedushin and myself conducted one of these studies, and Professor Cohen conducted another. The association between political orientation and attachment to Israel masked an underlying stronger relationship between religiosity and attachment to Israel. With the introduction of controls for religiosity, the association disappeared. So we can say, and we did say, that political orientation is not really a factor determining emotional attachment. It just taps into the real underlying cause, which is religiosity. The more secular are less attached, the more religious, more attached. But that is no longer the case, apparently. In the Pew data set, in the big Taglit Birthright Israel data sets, in the most recent American Jewish Committee survey, the association between political orientation and attachment to Israel persists even with the introduction of controls for religiosity. The association weakens, but continues. And so liberalism now is associated with some kind of weakening of emotional attachment to Israel. But what do we make of this? And does it mean that American Jews will distance from Israel in the future? To answer that question, I'd like to take us on a detour to research that I conducted with Professor Kedushin and my colleagues at the Cohen Center last summer, evaluation research of the Birthright Israel program. As part of the regular program evaluation of Birthright, we survey all applicants before the summer trips and then after the summer trips. Last year, we did a big survey of applicants in April, and then again a post-trip survey in September. In the post-trip survey, we include applicants who did not go on Birthright Israel trips. They are our control group. We asked questions about attachment to Israel, and then in the post-trip survey, because the Gaza war coincided with the summer trips to Israel, we also asked a bunch of questions about the Gaza war. So what did we find out? Look at the right-hand side of the figure. The first thing we saw was that participants, reflected in the columns marked P, became more attached to Israel over the course of the summer. That's hardly surprising. That's what we see whenever we do an evaluation of birthright Israel. But look at the left columns, marked NP, non-participants. The non-participants also became more attached to Israel over the course of the summer. We've never seen that before, and it is explained by the coinciding event, the Gaza war. The applicants to birthright Israel, tens of thousands of young people, about half of all young adult American Jews eventually apply to participate in that program, became more attached to Israel over the course of that contentious war. Perhaps even more surprising, the liberals, who comprise about half of the applicants to the birthright program, reflected in the left columns, also became more attached to Israel over the course of last summer's highly contentious Gaza war. What we see when we look at the figure from left to right is a general increase in emotional attachment to Israel as you move along the spectrum from liberal to conservative. That is consistent with the Pew study. But lo and behold, that Gaza war that we would have imagined perhaps might have depressed attachment to Israel among liberals actually had the opposite effect. It generated solidarity. Why? Well, it turns out that both participants and non-participants felt support for Israel during the war. We asked, what did you feel during the war? Did you feel support for Israel or estrangement? The participants and the non-participants, by and large, felt supportive of Israel. Relatively few felt estranged from Israel. And even the liberals, a majority, felt very much support for Israel during that war. We asked a variety of other related questions, and the same pattern was in evidence. So it appears that liberals are less emotionally attached to Israel than moderates, who are in turn less attached than conservatives. But in my view, we do not know yet how that observation will play out. We do not yet understand the dynamics of liberalism and attachment to Israel. No easy answer, in my view. So let's turn to the third hypothesis, the intermarriage indifference hypothesis. This is, again, an image from the Pew survey. The young adult children of intermarriage are substantially less attached to Israel than the young adult children. No, I'm sorry. Why am I saying young adult? Pew respondents who are the adult children of intermarriage are less attached to Israel than Pew respondents who are the adult children of in-marriage. And so there we see the impact of intermarriage in the previous generation on the current generation's attachment to Israel. Moreover, we learn from the Pew study that the American Jewish population is changing rather dramatically. The portion of each successive generation comprised of adult children of intermarriage is increasing. In the millennial generation born after 1980, half of all Jews are the children of intermarriage. So intermarriage is indeed associated with lower levels of attachment to Israel, and the portion of the Jewish population comprised of children of intermarriage is steadily increasing, and it will continue to increase. And so what of the future? Does this mean that American Jews will detach from Israel in the years ahead? Again, perhaps. I'm going to share with you some mitigating information. We'll come back to that slide. No, we won't. So the association between parental intermarriage and attachment to Israel is somewhat more pronounced in the millennial generation. For all respondents to the Pew survey, what does that say? Oh, it doesn't show the values. Okay. Okay, I'm not sure exactly why the slides didn't work out, and I'm almost done, so here. Okay, so I'll tell you off the top of my head. For all respondents to the Pew survey, adults who have intermarried parents, adults with intermarried parents, 17% of them very much feel connected to Israel. Those with in-married parents, 35%. When you look at the millennial generation, the disparity is greater. Just 12% among millennials with intermarried parents feel very much connected to Israel compared to 37% with in-married parents. So in the millennial generation, we're getting even more polarization around parental intermarriage. Now, this is also a mitigating factor with respect to the impact of intermarriage on overall attachment of American Jews to Israel. Why? Because the polarization means that the young adult children of in-marriage are even more Israel attached. In fact, if you look at the Pew data set and you only look at respondents with 2 Jewish parents, there is no relationship between age and emotional attachment to Israel. I opened this presentation by noting that an age-related pattern in Israel attachment has been a staple of all survey research of American Jews back into the 1970s. We can find evidence of it. Younger Jews have always been less attached. But today, if you do an analysis only of the children of in-marriage, there is no association. The young people are just as attached as the old folks. So there's some polarization, and that's perhaps a mitigating factor. Look at travel to Israel. Among the children of intermarriage, the values didn't show up, I'm sorry, but that dark blue square is 12%. Just 12% of the millennial under age 33 children of intermarriage have visited Israel, compared to an astounding 68% of the children of in-marriage. Now, you go back to 1990, the National Jewish Population Survey of 1990, just 25% of American Jews had ever been to Israel. Today, 68% of the under 33 young adult children of in-marriage have visited. So that's absolutely astounding. So one mitigating factor in the impact of intermarriage on attachment to Israel is the increased attachment and increased involvement of the young adults with 2 Jewish parents. But here's a second mitigating factor, and with this I'll conclude. When the Birthright Israel program began in 1999-2000, 20% of the applicants were children of intermarriage. The program then scaled. Today, it's sending nearly 40,000 young adults from North America annually on a trip to Israel. And as the program scaled, the proportion of young adult children of intermarriage increased. Today, 33% of applicants to Birthright and trip participants are the children of intermarriage. And so in 2015, 12,000 children of intermarriage from North America will visit Israel in the Birthright program, and many thousands more will visit in other frameworks. And so that 12% figure that you saw in the earlier slide of adult children of intermarriage who had ever visited Israel from Pew, that reflects the way things were. That portion is going to increase. With what effect? I'll show you my last slide. This also comes from our evaluation of Birthright Israel. Birthright, Taglit's impact on attachment to Israel by parental marriage. In the right, you see non-participants compared to participants among respondents with in-married parents, and you can see Taglit has a substantial impact. But now look at the 2 columns on the left. Taglit also has a substantial impact on the emotional attachment to Israel of participants with intermarried parents. And now, I wish I could circle this with red, but I can't do it, not easily. So look at the middle 2 columns. Okay, the middle 2 columns, the dark blue squares in the middle 2 columns. I'm going to do this out loud. Here we have children of intermarriage who participated in Taglit. 27% reported, with this I'm going to finish. I didn't tell you what the data shows. This is our long-term study of Birthright Israel. The survey was conducted in 2013 of a large sample of participants who were on the trip between 2001 and 2006. So this shows emotional attachment to Israel. 7 to 12 years post-trip. 7 to 12 years post-trip, 27% of participants with intermarried parents feel very much connected to Israel, compared to 23% of non-participants among the children of in-marriage. And so when young adult children of intermarriage go on a birthright trip, many years later, they have a level of emotional attachment to Israel that surpasses that of children of in-marriage who don't go to Israel. So what do I conclude? That even the lower level of attachment that we see in the population of children of intermarriage is mitigated perhaps by the huge surge in Israel travel. Whether that will be sustained in the future is unknown, but it's altogether possible that even this source of distancing will be somewhat mitigated in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Michal, Dov, and Ted, especially for these very enlightening presentations, with which I have to say, one, I learned, and two, I largely agree. So what I'm going to do is to try to provide a conceptual gloss on what we just heard, and to introduce somewhat alternate interpretations of the data with which we share. If there's one, there'll be a lot of if there's one. If there's one thing I'd like you to remember coming out of this talk, is that emotional attachment and political approval are two different things. Now, after having heard these talks, we're now learned in this matter. But I assure you that every time one of us gets a call from a journalist and is asked, well, are young people leaving Israel? Are they abandoning Israel? We immediately have to say, let's talk about this. Are you talking about attachment, or are you talking about approval of the policies of the sitting Israeli government? Those are two different matters. They're related, but they're quite different. So let me just talk a little bit about attachment, and then a little later I'll talk about approval. By attachment, that's measured by such questions as, which also helps us conceptually understand that, are you emotionally attached to Israel, which is the data that Ted and Dov cited. Do you care about Israel? Is Israel essential to your sense of being Jewish? Do you read about Israel? Do you talk about Israel? Do you listen to Israeli music? Do you contribute to charities because of Israel? This is all attachment type stuff. Do you have friends, by the way, do you have friends and family in Israel? How often do you visit? Which gets kind of mucks up the data analysis, but it's really part of the attachment. So having heard not just now, but for quite a while, both Dov's and Ted's analysis here, Ted is much more reserved than I am. I'll be saying that I think attachment is declining. Younger people are less attached, will be less attached. I don't think the results are going to that. But when the young people who are 25 today will have somewhat more attachment by 45, that they will totally replace the level of attachment we have right now. And I think intermarriage is a key factor. Another critical issue. My work, my analyses, and I would say we have to be looking at the distinction between Orthodox and everybody else. As my friend Jack Euclid once taught me, that there are two types of people in the world: those who divide the world into two, and those who don't. And in this case, I want to divide the world into two. I want to say that the rest of my talk, the rest of my analysis, is really a focus on the non-Orthodox. And I would say, in the future, if we could take out the Orthodox from all these analyses, it would help us understand the dynamics a little bit differently. Next, I'm about to say that I think that the younger age groups are permanently, are consistently less attached to Israel, but that takes place against the background of the demographic polarization of American Jewry. In general, religious groups in America have divided between the Christian frummies, the mainstream Christians, and the episodically or no religion Christians. It's kind of like three. Here we'll divide the world into three. And generally, the evangelicals, the Mormons, and smaller groups have been demographically holding their own. At times they were thought to be expanding, they're now thought to be holding their own. And clearly, the middle ground religions in America have been losing ground to no religion, sometimes religious, episodically religious, those groups. Every mainstream Protestant church and Anglo-Catholics have been declining heavily demographically over the last 30, 40 years. The same processes affect or characterize American Jewry. Because one thing about American Jewry is that we're seeing explosion in the Orthodox, solid, healthy growth in Jews who are weakly connected to Jewish life, partially Jewish, episodically Jewish. I'm Jewish, I have no religion. I'm Jewish and I'm Christian. To quote one respondent, I'm Jewish with my father, I'm Christian with my mother. There's a real respondent in New York. New York can get anything. We got one of those. And a commensurate decline of middle ground Judaism. Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionists, federations, non-Orthodox day schools, Jewish organizations. You can go one thing after another. If you're Jewish and if you're in a synagogue and you're losing membership over time, it's not the fault of your rabbi, your president, or your membership chair. It's probably due to larger demographic forces at work. How do we know? Because the Pew study tells us so. Between the ages of 50 and 69, I'm in there, there are about 1.7 million non-Orthodox Jews, 1.7, 1.8. Between 30 and 49, there are about 1.2 million non-Orthodox Jews. On every measure of Jewish engagement, the younger cohort I just mentioned, let's call it younger middle-aged versus older middle-aged, the younger middle-aged cohort scores lower on every measure that we can come up with that makes any sense. Such it is the case, and I did this calculation, if you look at the number of people who say, I am very attached to Israel, in my generation, we have, according to Pew, 550,000 such people. In the 30 to 49-year-old generation, we have 248,000 such people. Basically half. There are half as many non-Orthodox attached Jews in this younger cohort, and they are marching through the population, declining the number of active and committed Jews, in part because there are fewer of them, and in part because their percentages are lower. Now, if we look at age-related differences in attachment to Israel, let's just take one number. There are a lot, and I don't want to put them up. Is Israel essential to your being Jewish, which shows actually stronger effects than attached, but they both show the same effects. My generation, 53% of us say that Israel is essential to my sense of being Jewish. And it just keeps going down till you get to the 18, 29-year-olds, the millennials. We have only 30%. Again, there's a huge decline in attachment. Why is the decline in attachment taking place? As Ted correctly pointed out, heavily because of intermarriage, and that will change. As Ted and you and I have spoken about this, that may well change the dynamic. The up escalator that young people have been on over the years now operates differently for people who are intermarried. There are huge differences between the intermarried and the unmarried, or the children of the intermarried and the children of the unmarried, on all items in Jewish life, particularly the ethnic items in Jewish life, having Jewish friends, belonging to Jewish organizations, and so forth, and within that, especially things related to Israel. Israel takes one of the biggest hits by virtue of intermarriage, in part because of the inability of intermarried families to maintain Jewish identity in ways other than religious, and in part because Israel has no counterpart in Christianity. There's Pesach and there's Easter. There's Hanukkah and there's Christmas. There's God and there's God. There's Israel and there's what? There's nothing out there that looks like Israel that they got to replace. So I think that's part of it. And the numbers are huge. Like Israel, essentially, being sense of being Jewish, 33% among the children of the intermarried, 45% among where both parents are Jewish. Have you ever been to Israel? Intermarried, 15%. Children intermarried. Children with 2 Jewish parents, 50%. And Ted, the numbers that you get for continuity in attachment among the unmarried is exactly what I suggested in Tale of Two Juries, that as intermarriage increases, in-marriage becomes more selective. When my Uncle Solly intermarried, like, whoa, that was big news. And Uncle Solly had to go to California and get out of New York and the Lower East Side. When our children intermarry, hey, everyone's doing it. So that's where Jews are these days. So whereas Uncle Solly was the deviant case back in 1930, whatever the hell it was, the in-married are today deviant cases. They're the unusual ones, and they are more Jewish than because they're selected, and therefore Israel attachment will certainly stay firm among the younger people. But we're living in a world in which 80% of the Reformed children are marrying non-Jews. That's the world we have, and that's what's happening. And intermarriage is diminishing their attachment. So I want to, where I've been, shall we say, cautious or ambivalent or unclear about whether whether age is actually contributing to or related to declining attachment. I'm now pretty clear that that's what's going on. Next, let's turn to the other topic, which is approval. What's the component? What's the ways in which people approve or disapprove of Israeli policy? So what attitudes do they have? One, it's a skepticism. Let's say you're approving on the approval side. Skepticism that peace is possible. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the right wing tends to emphasize the dangers to Israel and consistently sends out messages. See, those Palestinians, look, those Arabs, they're really quite aggressive. They're not. You can't trust them, and even if you can trust them, they can't control themselves. They're inherently violent, and they really can't make peace. That's a right-wing view. A left-wing view is obviously quite the opposite. The next is those who approve believe that Israeli leaders are sincere. They're doing the best they can. They just can't get there, but they're doing the best they can. Next, settlements are okay. It's not great, but what's wrong with them? Next, U.S. should support Israel. And last and not least, Israel's better. If you look at right-wing publications and publications that support Israel, they're all about we're more moral, we're more insightful, we're more culturally vibrant, we're just better than the other people, implicitly and sometimes explicitly. So that's the kind of the complex of the I approve of Israel's policies measure. The opposite is I disapprove. Peace is possible. Israeli leaders are insincere. Settlements are horrible. U.S. should really consider giving different or less support to Israel. And we're just the same. Like, we have two people who are equal in conflict. So it turns out that and I think, Dov, you certainly went into this at great length, so I appreciate that. You saved me time. That the people who support Israeli policies are more religiously traditional, more politically conservative, and older. And one of the interesting things about this is the role of politics. I just finished doing another data analysis, and it just hit me how powerful the simple definition, are you very liberal, moderate, conservative, very conservative, how that variable completely determines, at least in this data set, completely determines your approval of Israeli policies. And obviously the liberals are the most disapproving, the very conservatives the most approving. And that distinction rides above and beyond the attachment to Israel. But in line with that, and here I'm changing my tune. In the paper I did with Ari Kelman in 2007, we said, it ain't politics, it's not liberal outrage, as you put it, it's a wonderful term, it's intermarriage. Intermarriage is intermarriage. I'm now saying, the Pew data, recent developments, your data, which was very enlightening, thank you for, a couple of years ago alerting me to this. I don't want to go through this, but yes, liberal approval has declined. There has been a carryover effect from liberal disapproval of policies to liberal detachment from Israel. Something I hadn't seen before. Such that, and this is to underscore a position that Dov has, we've never been so divided around Israel. I think someone has a paper here that will show us that we were, but in my memory, which is faulty, and in my historical studies, which are like negligible, it seems to me that we've never been so divided on Israel. There are really four groups, going from, shall we do right to left to right? Let's go from right to left. Why not? ZOA, Americans for Safe Israel, AIPAC, J Street, Amenu, Jewish Voice for Peace. They are in a continuum, and they symbolize the various constituencies that are out there, basically, and this Dov is right about this as well. Both sides see the other as un-Jewish and dangerous. You're the one with the wrong Jewish values. You're the one who's going to cause harm to Israel. But generally, it's the right that tends to want to exclude the left. This is not like an argument in symmetric incivility. There's more kind of these 75 incivility germs coming from the right, and about 25 coming from the left. There's some, but there really is an imbalanced equation. So that we're in it, and now to put it all together, we're in an age of societal political polarization. Never have Republicans and Democrats been as divided as they are, certainly on the elite level, actually in the population level, and commensurate with that, never have Jews been divided around Israel as they are today. And my wife, Marion Lev Cohen, pointed out to me that the UJA recently announced, the UJA of New York recently announced that they're showing two films on Israel. One is about a helmet. What's it called? Under the Helmet. And the other is this Rickless film. What's it called? Do you remember? All right. There's basically a right-wing film on Israel and a left-wing film on Israel. We used to have you have a rabbi, you need three. Orthodox, conservative, reform. You don't have to do that anymore. Like we're okay about that. Now, if you symbolize your attachment to Israel, you need a right symbol and a left symbol. Otherwise, we all won't feel included. And that's interesting. That's new. And that's the world in which we live in today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dov, Ted, and Stephen, for really interesting presentations. Before I ask you some questions, I want to have a little bit of a discussion between you three right now. I just want to give you the opportunity, if you have any questions, to ask each other, to take the time now to do so.
We have comments on each other's talks. Can we really reformulate the comments into questions? That's the challenge.
It's a big challenge, but I think you're up for it.
No, I'll ask Ted something.
Okay.
Ted, I know you're being careful, and it's very nice as a social scientist. I get that. But do you really believe, in light of all this intermarriage? I know you and I have had these conversations. We almost had this thing that I thought you invented and you thought I did, that it's a race between intermarriage and birthright, right? I like that. Yeah. So do you really think, I mean, I hope birthright wins, but do you really think with all this intermarriage going on and all the negative impact of intermarriage on Israel attachment that as we look into the future, there won't be fewer non-Orthodox Israel-attached Jews out there?
I think it really is very possible. And if you weren't so decisive in your judgment that that in fact the high rate of intermarriage is going to drive down attachment to Israel, then I would be in a position perhaps of being in the public arena saying that might very well happen. I think there's a good chance.
I'll back off.
But because you've staked out such a strong position, I find myself in the position of saying, yeah, but we have to see the other side. I think it's altogether reasonable to suppose that the sustained high rate of intermarriage is going to weaken ethnic connections to all things Jewish, including attachment to Israel. I think we do need to avoid, though, the mistake of looking at cross-sectional snapshot data and thinking that and believing that we're seeing a movie and believing that we're seeing in that snapshot the moving stream of American Jewish life as it develops and changes over time. And so let me just observe that we also learned in the Pew data, and I reported this in the Tablet Magazine article in 2013 in November, that the consequences of intermarriage are changing across the generations. And so about 35% of Generation Xers who were raised in intermarried families identify in the Pew survey as Jewish. Among millennials, it's 60%, a sharp increase in the proportion of children of intermarriage who identify as Jewish. And that isn't simply a reflection of their stage of life. How do we know? Because when we look at Jewish socialization and background, we see that the rate of bar mitzvah doubled between Generation X and the millennials. Millennials had much more, millennial children of intermarriage had more exposure to Jewish socialization. They were more likely to have attended Hebrew school, more likely to have celebrated a bar bat mitzvah, more likely to have gone to Jewish summer camp than their older counterparts in Generation X and indeed than the boomers who were themselves children of intermarriage. As intermarriage becomes a mass phenomenon in Jewish life, its consequences are changing, and young adults raised in intermarried households are much more likely to be Jewish, to have had Jewish socialization, to practice, to have attended a Seder or celebrated Rosh Hashanah than their older children of intermarriage counterparts. So the meaning of intermarriage in American Jewish life is changing. Is it changing rapidly enough to ensure the flourishing of American Jewry together with its attachment to Israel in the future? The jury is still out. Huge gaps remain between folks who were raised in two Jewish parent families as opposed to one Jewish parent. But that gap, while large, is in some respects narrowing. And what is crystal clear is that the children of intermarriage are getting much more Jewish socialization and are more likely to be Jewish.
I need one retort, and that is, I mean, you want to, Dove, chime in when you want. Now that we're talking about intermarriage, the reason the younger people show so much, attachment to being Jewish, 60%. By the way, if we get 60% of the offspring of the intermarried to identify as Jews, we're ahead of the game in terms of numbers. Because when two Jews marry each other, you use up two Jews. But when a Jew marries a non-Jew, you only use up one Jew at a time. So you only need half of the intermarried families to produce Jewish litters, and you're even, all right? So 60% is actually a gain. But the good news about intermarriage is because there's so much intermarriage that kids like our kids have a good chance of intermarrying. We now have Jewish day school kids who intermarried. This is fantastic because intermarriage is so widespread. So now more Jewish parents are coming into marriage, and they're having a greater success in raising Jewish kids. There is one problem, as you know, with looking at the 60%. It's only temporary because they haven't had a chance to marry yet. And children of the intermarried in the past have had like an 83% chance of marrying, 91% chance of marrying a non-Jew. So when people marry a non-Jew, they tend to shift their identities. If they're Jew, no religion, they become nothing. So So these people have yet to marry and experience life with a non-Jew. So they have one Jewish parent, one non-Jewish parent, and a fully non-Jewish spouse. How are they going to identify as Jews in the future? I am not very hopeful, and I don't really expect them to be extraordinarily committed to making Aliyah and supporting Habonim in the future.
All right. Dov, just before you say something, let's try to keep the conversation about attitudes towards Israel, even when we're talking about intermarriage. I don't want to make it into a piece.
Well, I did. I brought back Habonim.
I know, that was great. So I was
That
pointing that out.
I knew,
Case study.
I could feel it coming, and I was ready
Great,
for it.
exactly. So I was pointing out a successful response.
So
Yeah.
I just want
Go ahead.
to try and reframe the debate a little bit, because what we have, and it's very interesting, it's been a very big debate over the question of attachment to Israel and the so-called distancing, and you have here before you two of the leading voices in this debate. And I think to some extent I'm approaching this question in a slightly different angle, because I think while Stephen and Ted have engaged in the question of how high is the level of attachment to Israel and what is the future trend in attachment to Israel, which is a question I think that, and forgive me if I'm wrong, is of particular concern to sociologists, the two people on either side of me. I'm a political scientist and I'm interested in politics. And I'm particularly interested less on the level of attachment to Israel, although obviously that's important, whether American Jews are attached to Israel or not, but more in the content of that attachment, specifically how that attachment manifests itself, particularly with regard to support for the Israeli government. So I'm interested in politics, less interested, although I can see there's a big issue, and I think on the question of attachment, but how what does that attachment mean for the politics of the American Jewish community, and specifically what does it mean for the attitudes and politics of the American Jewish community vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which I think is, of course, a very central issue. So I guess my argument is, setting aside what are the trends in attachment for the moment, what I think is changing is the way in which American Jews express their attachment to Israel. That the content of attachment is changing, so that in years past, in decades past, attachment was expressed through largely unconditional support for Israeli government policies. It was also expressed through financial philanthropy, centralized philanthropy, something that Ted has discussed in his book on American Zionism. But in terms of the political manifestation, it was expressed through a kind of unconditional and uncritical support, for the most part, for Israeli government policies, and that meant policies concerning the Palestinians in particular. What's changing today, and I think with very serious implications, not only for American Jews, but also ultimately for the United States government and its policies toward Israel, is that a significant of non-Orthodox, as Stephen is right to remind us of, non-Orthodox American Jews are now expressing their attachment to Israel through criticism of Israeli government policies. That being critical of Israeli policies, particularly towards the Palestinians, is actually a way of expressing attachment, so that it is no longer that there is one size fits all. If you are attached to Israel, it means giving money to the annual federation campaigns and supporting whatever Israel does. It also means actually sometimes publicly voicing your disapproval of Israeli governments. And so what we have today is a growing and increasingly divisive debate over how American Jews should express their attachment to Israel. Mm-hmm. On the one side, we have, let's say, the traditionalists who say, if you love Israel, if you care about Israel, you should not criticize it. You certainly shouldn't do so in public. You should support the Israeli government. You must manifest your attachment or express your attachment in the ways that we've always done. And you have on the other side a growing segment who say, no, actually, we want to express our attachment through criticizing Israel, because we think Israel is is heading in a direction that is ultimately not only something that we disagree with in terms of our Jewish values or our broader political values, but also is ultimately endangering its survival as a state, or at least as a Jewish and democratic state. So I think there's a big debate over the content and how you express attachment, aside from the debate that we've heard so far in terms of what's the trend in overall level of attachment.
Yeah, thank you. Dov, can you comment a little bit? I know you've done some work on the identity politics within Israeli society. Mm-hmm. Can you perhaps describe what's the relationship between the identity politics that we're seeing in the American Jewish context as it relates to Israeli society?
Yeah, so what I've in a sense, one of my first book about the conflict within Israel, within the Israeli Jewish population, over Israeli identity and how that pertained to the peace process, in a sense, was a conflict between secular liberal doves and religious conservative hawks. And it was a conflict that I argued in Israel that underlying the domestic debate over the Oslo peace process, and indeed in general underlying the debate over the conflict with the Palestinians, is a deeper identity conflict, a cultural divide between these two parts of the Israeli Jewish population. And you could call them, I called them in the book Israelis versus Jews, right, to use these two categories, tribal, post-tribal, different ways of framing. To some extent, I would argue, since I wrote that book, that debate and that identity divide has been blunted to some extent, and I would trace that back to the Rabin assassination. And I think to some extent in Israel, the gulf that was widening between secular liberal doves and religious conservative hawks has actually been narrowed to some extent. It still exists, but I think a number of events, and Second Intifada in particular, have blunted that to some extent. But there is still this divide. We see now in the American Jewish politics that same division between secular liberal doves and religious conservative. The difference is that whereas in Israel there are forces and pressures that actually mitigate against that division, in the American Jewish context, those forces and pressures don't exist. So what countered the polarization of Israeli Jews is not present among American Jews as a countervailing force. I would also note that not only is the division among American Jews to some extent parallel to the division among Israeli Jews in the 90s, but it also is, as Stephen hinted at, I think, in his comments, is also parallel to a division we see in America. Sometimes it's colloquially referred to as the red state, blue state divide. It's a global thing. What we're seeing now is a underlying, and sometimes the Jews are like everybody else, only more so. It's an underlying process of polarization between secular liberals and religious conservatives in many different societies and in many different cultures. And I think what we're seeing in the American Jewish community is actually a microcosm of a much broader and deeper trend.
Yeah, Ted, you want to say something?
I'd just like to extend out the argument that Dov is making to one of its implications that we've not yet touched upon, and that is the question of Jewish power and influence, both vis-a-vis the halls of power in the United States and also vis-a-vis the State of Israel. The increased contentiousness and acrimony within the American Jewish community, characterized by competition over who is really pro-Israel and who has a right to speak in relation to Israel, the competition between AIPAC in the center, let's say, and the ZOA on the right, and J Street and Jewish Voice for Peace on the left. That competition, perhaps healthy, reflecting a strong feeling of engagement among American Jews with Israel, and that competition bringing of its own force increased activism into the fore as each side mobilizes its own in order to counter the influence of the other. All of that activism, however, it may have, I think, in fact, is having the unexpected, unintended consequence of dramatically weakening American Jewry vis-a-vis Israel and vis-a-vis the halls of power in the United States. In the 1970s and 1980s, the big Jewish organizations of the establishment well understood that Jewish power depended entirely on unanimity, on consensus, on presenting to the U.S. Congress a united front. Jews are no longer capable in the United States of presenting a united front, not in relation to the State of Israel and not in relation to Congress or the White House. And I think as a consequence, we have a paradoxical state of affairs. Increased Jewish caring and engagement with Israel is sparking increased activism, but that activism is across the political spectrum, is contentious, and I think a side effect of it is that when President Obama looks out the window, he thinks, well, all the Jews aren't going to agree with me no matter what. So I can do essentially what I want. I can sign an agreement secretly negotiated with the government of Iran and expect that, well, J Street will support me, and they'll say that they represent American Jews. Perhaps AIPAC will disagree, but the Jews don't agree among themselves, and so it doesn't really matter. The same holds true in Israel, when American Jews say that we insist on an end to the Orthodox monopoly with regard to personal status issues. The government of Israel can look at North American Jewry and say, hey, well, that's what the liberal Jews say. But that's not what we're hearing from the Orthodox Union. You know, American Jews, truth be told, are divided. And so I think a consequence of all of this excitement that this panel is a part of here in America is actually perhaps the sunsetting of American Jewish influence.
Ted, let me ask you a question. In your recent book, you spoke about how attachment and relationship between American Jews and Israel is not really diminishing; it's really changing forms. Mm-hmm. And I think a similar argument is often made by scholars about is Jewish identity or affiliation diminishing in America or simply changing. So I guess could you comment a little bit what kind of data, all right, or what kind of results to studies would have to convince a social science researcher to say engagement is actually diminishing, it's not just changing?
What kinds of studies would convince me that engagement is diminishing, it's not changing? Well, I think the same studies that we've been doing. We would want to see that the proportion of American Jews who give to causes in Israel is falling off, that the proportion who visit Israel is falling off. We would have to see that the surveys that we look at that measure emotional attachment to Israel indicate decline over time. I don't think we need instruments that we don't have. We just need to see indicators within those instruments that point to decline. We haven't seen it yet. It's been expected for a long time, but it hasn't yet surfaced. But because we're social scientists who can only, speak with authority to data, we can comment all we want, but we can only speak with authority to data. We can only say that up until now, there's no indication of weakening ties. But as we've all discussed, that picture could change. And I do think that we have the social scientific instruments that we need to detect change when it happens. We did that here. Stephen and I are both on the record saying that there's no connection between political orientation and emotional attachment to Israel. But now we both said here, actually, the data is changing. We're going to have to revise. There isn't a difference now. There is a connection now. So, it's very important to remember social scientists are not politicians. We can only speak to the data in front of us, and we have to reserve the right to change our interpretation as the evidence changes.
Stephen, let me ask you a question. You commented at one point, I think, that you don't necessarily agree that life stage corresponds to attachment to Israel. I think that's a point of difference between you and Ted, if I understood correctly. Could you comment a little bit about the fact that at different life stages, there's increased attachment to Israel as people get older, and whether that affects your view as to the overall lowering or increased attachment to Israel?
To elaborate upon earlier remarks, I believe life stage does in fact affect attachment to Israel. I believe that also as people get older, they're more at risk for having gone to Israel once or more. Mm-hmm. So you accumulate people who have had an Israel or two Israel experiences, and therefore that builds something into the equation. On life stage, I did a piece of research, and I remember seeing that the advent of children, not marriage so much, but having children, was associated with a bump up in Israel attachment. So I believe it works for people who are unmarried and for intermarried people who raise Jewish children. But given that so many people, 50% of people 25 to 39 are not married, much bigger than the intermarried. We've been talking about intermarriage, and I've been talking about it. 18% of Jews non-Orthodox Jews between 40 and 49 have never been married, and they're unlikely to have children now. So we now have a growing part of the population following larger Western and American trends that will never marry, and a large fraction of those who marry, most of the people who marry will intermarry. We only have a small minority of non-Orthodox Jews who are marrying Jews, and having Jewish children that they call Jewish. So that's why the up escalator of family life cycle that worked in the past, as Ted correctly pointed out, is not going to work for the vast majority of American Jews who will not marry a Jew. And that's why I think, and to conclude, when we look at the Pew data set and the age, Israel is essential to being Jewish. 4 age groups, from old to young. 53 of non-Orthodox. 53, 46, 37, 30. Like a nice down escalator. I got to say, like, all right, some of that's going to be mitigated to some extent, but you know, that's pretty huge. And the fact that the population, the non-Orthodox population of Jews, has shrunk. It's not like, as Shaul Kellner once said, the future isn't the future is here. Something like that. That more or less we just said. The future is here. We are already in the midst of Jewish, non-Orthodox Jewish population shrinkage. If everything stayed the same, we'd have fewer attached Israeli, pro-Israel Jews, and their numbers are going down. So I think there's no way we can avoid coming to the conclusion that the number of attached non-Orthodox Jews is in decline, not will decline, is in decline right now.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask some general questions, and you can choose whether you want to take it up or not, and then we'll open it to the audience. First, I want to ask, how do you think that the perceived rise of anti-Semitism around the world and the threat of a nuclear Iran, especially in light of what Ted said about the war in Gaza, which was really interesting, how do you think that is affecting or will affect attachment or relationship of American Jews to Israel?
Okay, thanks. Well, I'd like to answer, because actually I'm going to be working on anti-Semitism as my next research topic. I like to pick really non-controversial, easy subjects. So I think, again, on the issue of Iran, let's take that first of all. It doesn't play out, it doesn't impact in the sense that the divisions over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that I refer to among American Jews are also evident there with regards to Iran. Now, I haven't seen recent poll data on this, except data done by Gallup that overall shows that a majority of American Jews have been supportive of President Obama's policy toward Iran prior to the announcement of the nuclear deal. So, but anecdotally, I'm sure that there are the divisions because of the connection with with Netanyahu, etc. I think the divisions are there over Iran as well. Not that some left-wing American Jews don't see Iran as a threat or want Iran to get nuclear weapons, but simply that there's a debate over the President Obama's approach versus Prime Minister Netanyahu's. So I think the Iran issue only doesn't counter this polarization as I've described it, but in fact reinforces it, if anything. On the issue of anti-Semitism, I think it's more complex. First of all, I think we have to distinguish. There's always been a quite high level of perceptions of anti-Semitism among American Jews outside, and even in the United States. Obviously, you probably picked up the fact that I'm originally British, and so I hear quite often how these fears about anti-Semitism in Britain or in Europe in general, fears that I think to some extent can be overblown, but that's a topic for another day. But I think even on the question of anti-Semitism, there's a division, so that those who are more liberal on the left do sometimes tend to place less emphasis on anti-Semitism. It's less important in their overall worldview, if you like, and to some extent, and I think incorrectly, are not as quick to respond to some of these alarming trends. And it's one of the reasons why I'm working on this, because I think people need to pay attention to this. So I think in some sense there is a connection, and particularly in the UK, where a context I know, between the debate over Israel and the debate over anti-Semitism. So among British Jews, those British Jews who are broadly speaking on the left are also those who tend to be more critical of the view that anti-Semitism is a major threat to Jewish life in Britain. So the perception of anti-Semitism and perceptions of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict overlap. Those on the right see Israel as threatened and see Jewish life. And I think the same is true in France. So anti-Semitism in Israel are the perceptions of this, attitudes, political attitudes toward it are actually quite closely correlated. Whether they should be is a different matter, but I think anti-Semitism then and the fear of that, isn't a counteracting force. If anything, you have these two broad groups. On the one hand, the whole world is against us. We see this threat, and we need Israel more than ever. Iran, anti-Semitism, Hamas, etc. And on the other, those on the left who tend sometimes reactively to discount the threat of anti-Semitism because of because the people who are talking about anti-Semitism are sometimes seen as those coming from the right.
Thank you. Oh yeah, if you want to, you can.
Does it have to be on that topic?
You know what, you can say.
Okay, thank you. Stephen said something twice, and the first time I thought I'll let it go, but then the second time I thought, well, I have to respond. Yeah. Twice Stephen said that the number of non-Orthodox American Jews who are attached to Israel has dropped. I don't see how that can be the case. About 75% of American Jews were attached to Israel in 2013 in the Pew study, and in 2000 in the NJPS. But between those two surveys, we added 1.5 million American Jews to the overall Jewish population. Those are the estimates that were published by the NJPS and then also by the Pew Research Center, from 5.2 million, perhaps an undercount in 2000 to 6.7 million in 2013. If we go back to 1990, a more reliable national population survey, we still see that well over 1 million American Jews have been added to the population over the last decade or so. The level of attachment has remained stable, and so the overall number attached has actually gone up if we compare 2000 to 2013, from 2.2 million who say that they're attached to Israel up to 3.1 million who say that they're attached to Israel. More generally, Stephen's demographic narrative is a narrative of the shrinking middle. The middle is not shrinking. It is stable, but the right and the left are growing very rapidly. The Orthodox population in the United States is expanding. It's about 10% now, but it's growing rapidly. And the unaffiliated and weakly connected population is expanding and growing rapidly. And in between is the center that we care about very much, that supports our institutions. And Stephen is correct that the center is in a problematic situation, but not of numerical decline, rather of treading water.
Remember Jen Curtin? Saturday Night Live. Anyway, I'll.
Yes, I do.
So we tend to see the world differently. When I say that we're experiencing decline, I'm talking about the 50 to 70 versus the 30 to 50 generation. Looking at that demographic inverse pyramid. Number one, and number two, I worked on the 2000 study. Your colleagues criticized it. I criticized it. The 2000 study showed decline from 1990, which couldn't have happened. The difference between 1990 and today is that we added, I think, around 400,000 Orthodox. We added 300,000 or 400,000 immigrants and their children, and we also added people over the age of 65, especially over the age of 75. It's all part of the population.
And the millennial children of intermarriage who are disproportionately Jewish.
And I'm about to get there. And so the expansion occurred for reasons which are not likely to continue to replenish the shrinking Jewish middle. In fact, the only statistic that everybody likes is the news that Jews are living longer, except if you're anti-Semitic, in which case. But in this room, it's a winning finding. And the other finding, the other difference between the other way we've added people is that methodologically and sociologically, we now are able to count partially Jewish Jews or Jews with other religions who are identifying, and this is like, a product of fluid boundaries, who are identifying as Jews in the past who might not have, or our instruments are now asking people, which we didn't do before, this question that I helped design, Do you consider yourself Jewish, partially Jewish, or not Jewish? And the partially Jewish Jews are one half of the Jews with no religion, and they're a blessed addition to the population, but they do very little for Federation, conservative reform, Hadassah, all that stuff. So that's why I continue to believe that although we may have experienced a 1990 to 2013 growth in the Jewish population, I believe that we are now in the midst of a shrinkage of the number of active non-Orthodox Jews.
All right, let's just open it to the audience. I'd just like to ask you, when you ask a question, so just know.
Why?
We like questions. Let's start with the gentleman over here to the right.
Yes, I have two related questions. One is, if you know, have there been any surveys done of American Muslims, and
Yes.
Are the results similar? And related,
In what regard?
in regard to attachment or support
To Israel?
they're, you know, for Palestinian nationalism or Arab nationalism. And,
I think we did that.
related to that, I just was wondering whether you would comment on the attachment between religion and positions. And I'm thinking of Michael Walzer's new book, I think it's called Paradox of Liberation, Secular Revolutions and Religious Counter-Revolutions, where he, I think, looks at Algeria and Israel and India, and, you know, notes the curious phenomena that they were basically kind of secular nationalist movements that got overtaken by religion. And how did religion get linked in the way that the surveys show, you know, in light of that phenomenon?
Should we take a number of questions?
Yeah, let's take a couple. You don't all need to answer everything. Just choose the ones you want to answer. On the back over there. Yeah.
I'm just curious about the methodology behind the polls that purport to take a representative sample of the whole American Jewish population. Like, how do they locate the sample? How do they decide? Do they go through established Jewish institutions to find these people who
No.
are called Jews? No, they don't. And so how do we know that we're getting this population that might be completely detached from any Jewish institution, but like cognitively they identify as Jewish?
Right.
Because I think that population probably, just from anecdotal experience, would be more disproportionately Israel critical. So if you're missing that population, you might be skewing the results a little. And I found it interesting that at least some of the data that you showed an increase in attachment after the Gaza war, when we also know that the membership of Jewish Voice for Peace increases exponentially every time there is a Gaza war. So that seems to be a countervailing trend. So how can that be explained?
Let's take over here.
This is also a methodological question. When you use the word attachment, I have no idea of what you mean by that or what questions were asked. I personally, doing that, would say, do you consider yourself attached to Israel? And if so, name 2 Knesset members. No, I am not kidding when I say that. Have you read an Israeli newspaper in the last month?
All right, so
Not
the
daily.
question? Yeah.
So I would like to know how they ascertained what attachment means.
All right.
Okay, that's
Why don't we
enough.
take this 3 and then we'll take 3 more?
Okay, I'll answer the last couple. The methodological questions are just so easy, and the one about comparative diasporas actually teach that at Middlebury College. We'll see if we get to it. Maybe I'll have to let my colleagues. First, over the course of the Gaza war, attention to news about Israel during the past month surged. We asked in April, and then we asked in September, to what extent did you attend to news about Israel in the previous 30 days? And as a consequence of that war, attention to media absolutely skyrocketed among participants and non-participants. So we ask where you get your information. The emotional attachment to Israel question, there are 3 of them used in different surveys. One is, how emotionally attached are you to Israel? The other is, how close are you to Israel? And the third is, how connected are you to Israel? These are the 3 formulations that are used in different surveys. But of course, to do good survey analysis, we have to look at what is associated with each response and how responses change over time. Surveys do not, of course, speak for themselves. With regard to how you survey the Jews, well, there are different ways that this is done. We talk so much about Pew and about the National Jewish Population Surveys because they attempted to cast a wide net and used big screeners. And so for the Pew survey, 70,000 people were interviewed to identify the 5,000 Jews who participated in the survey. 70,000 people were asked a series of screener questions. What is your religion? Aside from religion, do you consider yourself to be Jewish? Do you have a Jewish parent? And on the basis of responses to the screeners, they got their sample. When you hear in the daily news about a survey of American Jews, typically that's done with a consumer panel, and the participants in those consumer panels tend to be more Jewishly affiliated. So there are differences that we need to be cognizant of. I'll stop there, so my colleagues can answer.
Just a quick answers. You mentioned the rise of JVP. TED's data speaks about attachment. So the increase of JVP members, according to Dove's, I mean, all of our, indicates an increased attachment to Israel.
They wouldn't say that, I think.
I don't care what they say. I'm telling you.
10% of the liberal Birthright Israel applicants became less attached to Israel as a consequence of the Gaza war. 41% became more attached.
Right.
This is a panel. We interviewed exactly the same individuals. So when I say 10%, that's not a cross-section repeated. That's of the same individuals who applied and were surveyed twice, 10% of those individuals who identify as liberal were less attached after the Gaza war. Maybe they turned to Jewish Voice for Peace. 41% were more attached. 49% were steady state.
So when I opened my talk by saying you have to distinguish attachment from policy approval. And now imagine a grid. I have a phone ringing. Where is this? I know, I forget. Okay. You have to have a grid in which you have attachment and policy approval. So JVP is policy disapproval attached. And a person who's not involved and then becomes involved in JVP, they are attached to Israel. I'm agreeing with Dov. But they deeply disapprove of Israeli policies, and as opposed to Amenu, they also, I think, disapprove of the notion, or they don't approve, they come fight for the notion of the Jewish state of Israel. You want to
Yeah, I agree. I think there's some, and I think we've
Fix it.
actually.
Okay, it's okay.
You show me some figures which suggest this, that within this group, there is, within, let's say, the JVP supporters, there are the Israel attached but critical, as well as the ones who have become alienated as a result of Israel's policy. The formerly, so let's say the alienate. So I think, first of all, we shouldn't lump all JVP supporters together. There are variations within that. And I think we're talking about a small subset of the American Jews. So I think the fact that JVP experienced a surge in support after the Gaza war doesn't really contradict the fact that overwhelmingly most American Jews were supportive of Israel. Although I think TED surveyed, because birthright participants or even birthright applicants, people who are members of JVP, are not going to be generally applying to birthright. So I think it's true it doesn't capture that. And I think there is a segment of alienated, politically alienated, critical, and that they are the core members of JVP, and they are growing. And so I think, as I say, my interest is in the politics of it, and so that is a significant, even though it's numerically small group within the, and maybe not captured in some of this broad survey data, some numerically small, but vocal and significant, and from college students, they are having a major impact in terms of shaping the debate, particularly on college campuses. So even if it's not a big trend, it's a significant development nonetheless.
And to your question, no one's going to respond. Michael Walls is terrific. I didn't read the book. On your question, I would urge you not to set high barriers for attachment, such as knowing 2 Knesset members. It's high. It's very high. It leads to both not only distortion, but it leads to, frankly, it's it's counter our, I would say, our policy. I am not a neutral social scientist. I actually want to see more Jews attached to Israel. Those are my values. And values like that, is saying you're not attached to Israel unless you can name 2 Knesset members, is, frankly, an exclusionary barrier that we don't want to project. Halavai, I don't know why they should know the Knesset members, but all right. But they should know more about Israel. We all agree. But when we social scientists look at these data, and we Jewish policy people look at these data and think about these data, we want to be able to say if a person says they're attached and has a little supportive evidence, that's enough for me. And I'm saying on the question of that, using that low standard, which I agree is low, there's decline by age, by intermarriage, by liberal versus conservative, and we should look at that. You're asking for an elite definition of attached, also interesting, but one which ought not to replace the more, I would say, inclusive operational definition of who's attached to Israel.
I remember,
quick point?
Yeah, just a quick point. I remember Stephen conducted surveys back in the 1980s now asking, could you identify which party Perez belonged to? This was the AJC survey, and even in the 90s, many American Jews can't even identify which party they would know he would be prime minister in the 80s, but they didn't know which party. And so if you take knowledge and what I'm saying is a large part of American Jewish attachment historically has been based upon a large degree of ignorance of actual Israeli history and politics. So if you make it a kind of knowledge quiz, then yeah, you're going to be very disappointed.
Let me just take some more questions. Over here, one question.
I'd like to. It's a dynamic of time, but I have something to say in response to your question.
You want to give a quick response?
Okay, very quick response. The normal state of affairs among diasporas is to support a whole variety of homeland causes. Diasporas typically are fragmented. The American Jews in the 1950s, 60s, through the 1980s were exceptional in their consensus and unanimous support for Israel's governments. As a consequence of knowing much more about Israel today, much more interaction with Israelis, more visits, more consumption of Israeli news, American Jews are becoming in effect a diaspora of Israel. That's a new phenomenon, and that's why American Jews are dividing their support for a whole variety of homeland causes. That makes us like the Croatians, the Mexicans, the Greeks, the South Asians. The situation of unified support for AIPAC and the United Jewish Appeal, that was exceptional. American Jews today are becoming a typical diaspora, and that's why we're losing our capacity for collective action.
All right, can I just take 3 questions over here?
So I want to bring it back to the point that Dov is making of talking about politics. One of the things that's interesting about the data, mostly coming out of the AJC data, in terms of attitudes on some of these political issues, is although the sociological evidence may suggest a certain amount of detachment, although there is oscillation on these issues, the hot-button issues that deal with settlements or a Palestinian state or other such issues, there doesn't seem to be any trends moving in one direction or another. There's oscillation, and it seems to be relatively stable, which then raises the question, which is to Dov, which is this actually just a matter of changes in attitudes that are taking place, or is this actually an institutional change that is taking place that now, where there had not been institutional vehicles for collective action for the left that now exist, that helps to explain what's happening, and that what in essence has happened is, as a result of detachment from mainstream Jewish organizations, that this has now manifested itself in organizing and mobilizing on these issues where they had not. And just for the sociologists, if you can just comment on if there is this changes in attachment or not, why is it that there doesn't seem to be major changes attitudinally on some of these political issues?
Let's take 2 more questions. Yeah, right here.
So my eyes glaze over when we talk about statistics, so I apologize if I'd like to move a little bit away from that part and talk a little bit about when you talk about intermarried children of intermarried. And I wonder how much of their falling interest might have to do with the politics of, and religious politics of recognition of whether or not they're Jewish. And whether
Of
or not-
recognition of?
Recognition of whether or not they're Jewish,
Yeah.
because whether or not their mother is Jewish or their father is Jewish. And how much impact that has on their attachment to both the religion and to Israel.
We can look at that.
That's it. Just one question from the back over there.
Hi. Just one question for all three. One element of consensus that I hear among all of you is that this is a moment of great change. This is something that is rapidly changing the foundation of how American Jews approach Israel. And I wanted to know if you could all reflect a little bit on what is driving that change. So one thing that I heard is American politics, which is fragmented and rancorous, but I'm not exactly sure if that's really an element of great historical significance. When has there not been a moment in the recent future where there hasn't been great division in American politics, perhaps since the 1950s? Is there something you can point to, at least in the American case, that really explains why it is such that these great changes are occurring?
Just real quick, on the AJC data, I would say the AJC data, and actually I feel like a Lloyd Benson moment. I know the AJC data. I love the AJC data. Take it from me. I started the AJC data in 1983, 1982 actually. Sorry?
But you're not David Harris.
Right. But I want to assure you that what the AJC data are limited because they can only look at Jews by religion. And 33% of Jews under the age of 30 say I'm Jewish, but I have no religion. Like they're not, there was one, the AJC data are holding the Jews by religion, and that group actually is in a sense becomes more Jewish over time. So I don't see that. Is that clear? Like I'm looking at a strange face.
Only because since you said that Jews are becoming more Orthodox, one would expect then that their views would become more hardline.
Right, and they're holding steady, so or more attached. So the AJC religion Jews, and that's what they are, have more Orthodox and exclude more and more and more the Jews who are Jewish but will not say my religion is Jewish, and therefore the AJC data become more and more selective over time. We need to change the AJC sample to include Jews of that religion. So that's really what that's the issue over here. On your question on the children of intermarriage, I largely feel that Israeli actions about the issue that you spoke about, and in general, the official Israeli policy of not recognizing a lot of people who are unorthodox, basically, I think it has only a very minor effect on people and not a major effect. I know they feel bad about it, but there are so many huge, there's great predictability about who is Israel engaged and not Israel engaged, that issue is not all that critical. But however, I looked at Ted and I said, you know what, we could run the Pew data set to look at children of Jewish mothers versus children of Jewish fathers who are already Jewish and see how they feel about Israel, so we can get you an answer on that question. It's a very interesting hypothesis. My instinct is probably not so much. And the question in the back, what's the question in the back?
I'll answer it.
Thank God.
And Doville, also, I'm sure the question in the back was about institutional changes, and that's related also to the question about
that was the question.
About what has driven them. The institutional changes is that the united front that American Jews presented through their organizations weakened in the late 1980s, disintegrated following the Oslo Accords, and today there's a very strong center that seeks consensus but can't achieve it. It's flanked by independent partisan organizing and lobbying on the right and on the left. And what brought this about? Well, I'll just mention three factors. First, Israelis. Up until the Oslo Accords, it was a norm within the Israeli polity that whoever got to form the government might have gotten 51% of the Knesset, but they get 100% of the diaspora, right? The government can rely upon wall-to-wall support from the Jewish diaspora, especially in the critical United States. After the announcement of the Oslo Accords, Netanyahu, heading the opposition, came to the United States together with other Likud officials in organized opposition to the Oslo Accords. He broke the united front of the Jewish lobby in the United States. And since then, the Israeli opposition has felt that it ought to have its own diaspora. Why concede the diaspora to the Israeli government? So today, the outs in Israeli politics come to the United States and make common cause with their American supporters. You go to a J Street convention and the roster of labor officials are on the podium. The same thing is true at a ZOA meeting. You get the activists in the right-wing parties. So we have a new transnationalism at work here in which American Jews make common cause with their Israeli counterparts, and this is instigated by Israelis largely. The second factor is globalization. American Jews know way more about Israel today than they used to. And they get their news from partisan Israeli sources. And they visit Israel and hear about partisan debates. When you read Haaretz, it's harder to be indifferent to the policies of the Israeli government. But likewise, if you get your news from the Jerusalem Report. And so globalization has brought American Jews closer to Israel, and it's made it more difficult for them to be neutral with respect to Israeli policies. And then I guess I could say third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, but I'll just name one more cause. Obama. We know in the social movement theory that when you get a big change of government, you get new opportunities for social mobilization. And the election of Barack Obama in 2009 created a huge opportunity for the Jewish left to get organized in a more serious way and created space for J Street. And that has also been a factor.
Yeah. So I would agree with in terms of the in terms of what's the causes. I mean, there are many causes, and I'm going to make a big plug for my book because I'm going to be examining all of these causes. So it's very hard to summarize them. I agree that the export of Israeli partisan politics into the American Jewish context is one factor. The weakening of central institutions that normally were traditionally able to both channel and create consensus. I think that there's been changes, obviously, in Israeli policies, in the nature, in not only are American Jews learning more about Israel, but there have also been significant shifts since the late 70s in Israel, in Israeli domestic politics and Israeli policies. There have also been changes in the very nature of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's no longer seen as a David versus Goliath, but in some respects it's seen in completely polar terms. So I think how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is perceived. And I think there are also shifts within deep cultural changes, as well as demographic changes that Stephen's been talking about, deep cultural changes within the American Jewish community at large, and indeed among many diaspora Jewish communities. A growing sense of security, a lessening of the intra-group cohesion that comes from that's both a product of American Jewish success and integration in American society, and therefore less of a sense that we must stick together. We are endangered, that there's this sense of a shared fate, and I think some of that is the natural consequence, if you like, of successful integration into American society at large. So I think there's change. It's not all because of what's happening in Israel. It's also because of what's happening within the American Jewish community and within the United States in general. Very, very briefly to the question, which is a great question, on to what extent is this institutional change versus attitudinal change. I think there has been a shift in attitudes that has been happening. I would trace it back to at least the first Lebanon War to 1982. And I think it's been going on for some time. But certainly those attitudinal changes have not always successfully materialized institutionally, although there's been successive attempts to create vehicles to express American Jewish dissent with regards to Israeli policies. But I think what has happened has been partly as a result of the underlying changes in the kind of philanthropic environment, the decline, the ability of having startup organizations, low startup costs, allowing new groups to emerge and enter the political marketplace, has allowed that attitudinal change and has accelerated it, if you like, and allowed it to find more concrete expression. So I would say what's happening is both attitudinal change on the grassroots as well as on the elite level, as well as a decline of the central or centralizing mainstream institutions that once dominated American Jewish religious and political life, and a mushrooming of smaller organizations which both reflect this new diversified political climate as well as reinforce it, because with groups like J Street, etc., then and JVP then also reinforce these tendencies. So it's both, to put it simply.
Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to take 3 questions from the audience, and please try to keep them as brief as possible. And when you answer the questions, this will be like your concluding remarks. So if there's any last point you want to make, figure out how to make it in the form of an answer to the question. So let's take, yeah, over there. Yeah.
Quick question. One of the main themes throughout the discussion was the notion of polarization, or as Steve calls it, the shrinking middle. I'm curious, what do you see as the policy implications based on that observation, or perhaps educational implications? Where to?
All right. I just can't see the person on the back over there. Reading. Trying to. Yeah.
I guess my question is mostly for Steve, but
Hi, Eric.
I'm more concerned exclusively with the continuation of American Jewish not attachment to Israel, but attachment to Judaism. And I were king, I would take the money that is going towards Taglit and put it towards camp. It's a genuine experience. Work for my daughter. What Israel is complicated, it's vicarious, problematic in a million ways, whereas camp breeds over time an incredibly powerful attachment, creating on these issues. And it also addresses the whole issue of what does it mean to be an American Jew, to some degree, which Israel does not. Is that politically impossible? Is it a bad idea? What's the problem with that?
All right. And let's take 2 more. Over here.
My question is similar to the question the gentleman asked from back there about the forces the external forces that drive the attachment or lack thereof to Israel. And you've discussed 2 of those, and one is intermarriage and the one attitude to religion, but nobody spoke in any consistent or systematic way about the demand of the ruling political class for a message from the grassroots. And what seems to me have happened was that prior to election of Obama, there simply was not a demand. There was supply of Bash Israel, quote unquote, for simplicity's sake, messaging, but there was no demand for it. Now that Obama came,
let's have just a question.
Yeah. So the question is, isn't that the very, very major force equals to that of intermarriage and and affiliation with religion? The demand from the White House, from the political class, for a particular kind of messaging where people who have the supply of those suddenly start organizing and say, oh, okay, now we've got demand for what we can supply. And isn't that what's happening now? And will that not change with the next administration that may not be as receptive as Obama to such voices?
Okay, I'll just take one more question. Over here. Yeah.
So it seems that the terms of the political debate, the political terms are set by a very small number of people. Very wealthy philanthropists, people like Peter Baynard, a small group of activists on campus. And my question is, how do...
Not us. We're not in there.
Right, so, how do how does this massive data relate to the terms of the political debate, which are set by a very small number of people? And in particular, are there points where the big data and the political realities don't align, and where are some of the contradictions between the large data and the really, and the political making and questions that are driving the debates?
Yes, I know there's a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask you to be as brief as possible, about 2 minutes each, to try to address whatever you can.
Okay. Yeah, that's going to be really, that's a great question, but very difficult to answer in just 2 minutes.
I'm sorry.
Okay, I very briefly, I don't think this is the deepening debate among American Jews over Israeli government policies that I've described is because coming from the Obama administration. I think you could say some of the initial political visibility that J Street enjoyed is obviously because of the perception that they had support within the White House. But this is a trend that goes back well before Obama entered the White House. This is a trend that, as I said, dates back at least to the early 1980s. So I think it's not something that's as a result of American out of the White House. In terms of the elite, so yes, elite shape political debates. And so it's, and what we've been talking about to some extent has been mass attitudes. I think the elite debate is very important because it obviously influences to some extent the attitudes of the wider, the attitudes of the masses, right? So I think the big difference is the mass of the overall are not as polarized as the elites are. What's happening is elite polarization is affecting, it's not entirely, it's not a one-for-one correlation, but is filtering into a mass level attitude. So I guess one big point is that we should not mistake the existence of JVP for all American Jewish concepts. That's the elite. They are in a sense the elite. They're highly engaged. They're highly politicized. Similarly, those involved in J Street U, these are important debates. They do shape the wider attitudes, but there's a higher level of polarization and division among elites than among the masses. On the question of what are the policy implications for this, I think the big implication is we need to focus, for me, I mean, maybe, to challenge Ted and Stephen a bit, less attention on attachment, which has been the question that has dominated American Jewish discussion about Israel for the last 2 decades since the NJPS survey. The attachment, has been the big question. We need to focus less on attachment. We need to talk more about the politics and the polarization, and we need to accept, instead of we need to find ways to accept that these political divisions and differences are here to stay. This is not merely a temporary aberration. It's not merely because of Obama. It's not merely because of Netanyahu. They're long-term things, and we need to find ways to manage political difference, to accept the fact that we are now entering an age of political diversity within the American Jewish community when it comes to Israel. We need to accept political diversity as a sociological fact, and we need to find better ways to teach and practice tolerance of political diversity within the American Jewish community.
Thank you, Deb.
So I would say we have remarkable agreement across the table. I think we see the past in very similar terms and understand the present likewise in similar terms, and perhaps we have some modest differences in how we see the future or in our confidence in our capacity to see the future. With respect to the broader political debate, all of us participate in it, but perhaps not in league with Jeffrey Goldberg or Peter Beinart or some of the others, but or in the league with J.J. Goldberg. But to the extent that we have a shared message, I think it is indeed that we can set aside this conversation about attachment and focus instead on what is really happening, which is a deep political argument among American Jews that's comparable to the political argument happening in Israel. And by making that known, I think we contribute something valuable to the ongoing commentary, because in effect we tell the commentators, let go of this issue of loyalty. Let go of this issue of attachment. American Jews are connected to Israel. They're attached to Israel. That's not going to change. At least hasn't changed. Probably not going to change, at least not in the near term. What's at stake here is how we view this, what threatens Israel, what's in Israel's best interest. And there's a lively political debate about that, but that political debate is not constructively informed by this notion that one party or the other is disloyal. And to say unattached is kind of a way of saying disloyal. I'm going to set that aside, and I think we make a contribution by making that point loud and clear. And secondly, several questioners asked what are the policy implications. We all slip very easily into this conversation, but I should recognize that we're at NYU, and scholarly conversation with no necessary linkage to Jewish public policy. But if the question is how do we sustain support for, or let's say if the question is how do the folks who would like to see support for Israel continue among American Jews, how can they best achieve their aims? And I think there's probably shared advice at this table also. Certainly, I've had this conversation many times with Stephen, and the answer is intensive Jewish experiences, immersion experiences like camp and like Israel trips. They are the most effective vehicles for those who seek to cultivate support for Jewish life and for ongoing attachment to Israel in the future.
And to pick up on that last point, and to answer David's question, Eric, that was you back there, right? That was me. Great. Thank you for we're going to shift that conversation. And the other part of my life has been involved with this issue, and we've developed 3 principles: build Jewish social networks, deliver Jewish meaning and content, and do so within definable life stages. And if you put those 3 principles together, and then you think about the Jewish future, the critical group to influence now would be adolescents and young adults, basically age 16 to 34. And within your daughter's purview, and echoing Ted's, and we're all on the same page here, a comment, you should know, and I saw my wife smiling when you were answering that question, expanding Jewish summer camps, enrollment in Jewish summer camps, especially building Hampton Inn camps rather than Four Seasons camps, which is really a critical issue because of the issue of affordability in Jewish life, becomes my personal number 1 policy priority, along with Israel trips for 16 to 17-year-olds, which are not now funded by anything like a birthright, as well as Jewish youth groups, of which only 2 are getting massive funding. Lynn Schusterman is BBIO, Lynn Schusterman, and NCSY Coca-Cola. That was a joke. Coca-Cola is the biggest supporter of the OU Heckscher industry, and the OU Heckscher industry provides $10 million a year to NCSY. NCSY has a fabulous operation along with BBIO. So it shows, in specifically for youth groups, money matters, and it also matters for camps, and it also matters for low-cost Israel trips, which do not exist for 15, 16, 17-year-olds, and they should. So in answer to David and Eric's question, that's basically the conceptual superstructure and the specific policy points that we need to advocate, and certainly we would all welcome that. And you don't need to steal Kilu, as if, from Birthright in order to fund camps. The people who are funding Birthright are funding Birthright. God bless them for that, at least that part that they do for Birthright, and not the other things. Newt Gingrich probably didn't like that comment, but all right. And we can and should mobilize philanthropic and economic support for Jewish socialization instruments in the adolescent and, frankly, in the college and young adult years as well.
All right, so I just want to really thank our panelists. Thank you so much, Ted, Dov, and Stephen, for really stimulating and exciting conversations. And I hope we continue this right now when we go to lunch outside. Thank you.
A brief announcement. Thank you, Michal, and thank you to all the panelists for a fabulous discussion. One wonders if there's anybody left in the Jewish community, especially in the younger age group, who has not been surveyed. And to point out, one of the advantages of Aliyah is that you will never be surveyed again.
Lo nachon, there's a Pew survey coming out in a few months.
I take it back. A light and kosher lunch is available outside, and you are all invited to participate. We resume our discussions in half an hour at 1 o'clock, when we will be examining the Israel experience and Israel education, picking up where we left off just now.